They left me shivering at a downtown Greyhound bus station in the middle of a brutal blizzard just to film a prank video for the internet. They drove away laughing, betting on whether I would cry or beg them to come back. I did neither. I boarded a bus to Chicago and erased them from my life. For 10 solid years, I did not receive a single text message, a birthday card, or a concerned voicemail. They never filed a missing persons report. They never tried to find me. But this morning, I woke up to 90 missed calls and a barrage of frantic voicemails from the very people who threw me away. They did not call because they suddenly missed their daughter. They called because they were desperate, and they realized I was the only one who could save them from the devastating consequences of their own greed. My name is Sydney. I am 33 years old, and I am the founder of a highly successful independent forensic accounting firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build your own empire after your family tried to completely destroy your self-worth. The glowing screen of my phone felt heavy in my hand as I sat behind my mahogany desk, overlooking the sweeping Chicago skyline. 90 missed calls from Brenda and Richard, the two people I used to call Mom and Dad. My pulse drummed in my ears, but my mind remained sharply analytical. In my line of work investigating corporate fraud and money laundering, I knew that people who ignore you for a decade do not suddenly dial your number 90 times out of sudden parental affection. They do it out of sheer panic. I was just reaching for my coffee, trying to process the notification screen, when the office intercom buzzed loudly. My receptionist sounded genuinely alarmed, her voice shaking slightly over the speaker. She told me there was an older couple causing a massive scene in the lobby, demanding to see me immediately. They were refusing to leave and threatening to call the police if I did not come out right that second. I calmly pressed the intercom button and told her I was on my way out. I stood up and smoothed the front of my tailored navy blazer, taking a slow, deliberate breath before opening the frosted glass doors to the reception area. The moment I stepped out, the tension in the room was suffocating. There they were. Richard was pacing aggressively across the polished marble floor with his chest puffed out, wearing a designer golf shirt that screamed newly acquired wealth. Brenda was leaning heavily against the reception desk, tapping her manicured nails impatiently against the stone counter and glaring at my terrified receptionist. 10 years had aged them, but it had not softened their profound arrogance. When the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind me, they both turned. I braced myself for some kind of emotional reaction, but there was no gasp of relief. There were no tears of joy. There was absolutely no apology for leaving their 23-year-old daughter stranded in a crime-ridden neighborhood in the dead of winter with nothing but a suitcase. Instead, Brenda let out a loud, irritated sigh, rolling her eyes exactly like she used to do when I was a teenager who had just missed curfew. She marched right up to me, completely ignoring the physical space between us, and practically shoved a thick stack of heavy manila folders directly into my chest. "Sign these right now," she snapped, her voice echoing loudly and unpleasantly in the quiet professional lobby. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not comment on the fact that I was alive and well. She did not ask a single question about the life I had built. She just pointed a perfectly polished finger at a bright yellow sticky note attached to the top page of the document. "Your sister needs the capital for her new house, and we need to release these family funds by 5 o'clock today. We have a direct flight back to Atlanta in exactly 3 hours, so stop being dramatic, grab a pen, and just sign the papers." I looked down at the documents in my hands. The legal jargon was dense, but my eyes caught the critical phrases immediately. It was a blanket power of attorney form granting them total unrestricted access to a trust fund I did not even know existed. A trust fund with my name on it. Richard crossed his arms, stepping closer to physically intimidate me, just like he used to do when I was a child. "Come on, Sydney," he barked, his face reddening. "You pulled this little vanishing act for 10 solid years over a completely harmless joke. We let you have your little tantrum, but it is time to grow up and act like part of this family again. Do not make us do this the hard way right here in front of your little employees." I did not step back. 10 years ago, the sheer volume of his voice and the aggressive posture of his body would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have shrunk into myself, desperate to appease him, to avoid the inevitable explosion. But I was no longer a frightened 23-year-old girl hoping for parental approval. I was a certified fraud examiner who routinely interrogated hardened corporate embezzlers and uncooperative executives. Richard was nothing more than a bully in a golf shirt trying to cash a check that did not belong to him. I held his furious gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment before calmly dropping the thick stack of manila folders directly into the sleek stainless steel recycling bin next to the reception desk. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the bottom of the bin echoed in the dead silence of the lobby. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I do not know what kind of financial mess you and your favorite daughter have gotten yourselves into, but you will not be using my name or my signature to dig yourselves out of it." Brenda let out a dramatic gasp, pressing a hand to her chest, as if I had just physically struck her. "How can you be so incredibly selfish?" she shrieked, her carefully maintained public facade cracking instantly. "Madison is your blood. She is building a life, and you are sitting up here in this fancy office hoarding money that belongs to this family. You owe us this, Sydney." "I owe you absolutely nothing," I replied smoothly, crossing my arms to mirror Richard's stance, but with a relaxed confidence he could never possess. "You left me at a bus station in the middle of a blizzard to film a prank video. You drove away. That was the end of my obligations to this family. Now I am going to ask you to leave my place of business before I have you physically removed." Richard's face shifted from red to a dangerous shade of purple. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. He jabbed a thick finger in my direction. "You want to play hardball, you ungrateful brat?" he sneered, lowering his voice to a menacing hiss. "Fine. I will dial 911 right now and tell the Chicago Police Department that when you ran away 10 years ago, you stole my $2,000 work laptop. It was company property. We let it go because we felt sorry for you, but I will file the report today. Let us see how your fancy, high-end corporate clients react when their star accountant is arrested for grand theft right here in her own lobby." He hovered his thumb over the screen, waiting for me to panic. He was waiting for the frantic apologies and the desperate pleas for mercy that he had trained me to deliver throughout my entire childhood. Instead, I smiled. It was a small, cold smile that made Brenda take a distinct step backward. "Please do," I told him, gesturing openly toward his phone. "Dial the number. But before the dispatcher answers, you might want to consider a few basic legal facts. First, the statute of limitations for felony theft in Illinois is 3 years. You are about 7 years too late. Second, filing a false police report is a Class 4 felony. Third, every square inch of this lobby, including the exact spot where you just attempted to legally blackmail me, is recorded with high-definition audio and video." I pointed to the discreet black dome camera mounted directly above the reception desk. "It has been recording every single word of this extortion attempt since you walked off the elevator," I continued. "So go ahead, Richard. Make the call. I would love to hand that footage over to the district attorney." Richard froze. His thumb hovered over the screen, trembling slightly with suppressed rage. He looked up at the camera and then back at me, realizing with sudden, sickening clarity that he had walked blindly into a trap of his own making. The power dynamic had completely inverted, and he was entirely unarmed. I did not wait for his next empty threat. I turned my head slightly toward the large security desk near the elevator banks, where a broad-shouldered building guard had been quietly observing the altercation. "Officer Davis!" I called out, keeping my tone polite and professional. "These 2 individuals are leaving now. If they refuse, please physically escort them out. If they ever return to this floor or attempt to bypass the front desk downstairs, I want them arrested immediately for criminal trespassing." The guard stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "Yes, ma'am," he said, nodding respectfully to me, before turning a stern glare on my parents. "You heard the lady. It is time to go. Step toward the elevators right now." Brenda looked genuinely horrified. "You cannot do this to your own mother," she sputtered, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and profound embarrassment. People are watching you. This is completely unacceptable. Have a safe flight back to Atlanta. Brenda, I said, turning my back on them and walking steadily toward the frosted glass doors of my inner office. I did not look back even as Richard began shouting obscenities as the security guard firmly guided them into the waiting elevator car. The heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off his tirade mid-sentence. The lobby plunged back into a serene professional silence. My receptionist stared at me with wide, shocked eyes, her hands frozen above her keyboard. Hold all my calls for the next hour, I told her smoothly, and send an email down to building management. I want their photos distributed to every desk guard in the main lobby. They are permanently blacklisted from this address. I walked into my office and closed the door, taking a deep breath of the quiet air. My hands were perfectly steady. I had won the physical standoff without raising my voice a single decibel. But as I sat back down at my desk staring out at the city below, I knew this was far from over. People like Richard and Brenda did not just walk away when there was money on the line. They would find another way to strike, and they would use someone with real power to do it. It took exactly 58 minutes for that strike to land. I had just finished reviewing a complex ledger for a corporate client and took a sip of my now lukewarm coffee when my computer chimed with an urgent incoming message. It was not a standard client inquiry. The email bypassed my general intake folder and landed directly in my secure personal inbox, tagged with a high-priority red flag. The sender was a prominent, aggressive corporate law firm headquartered right here in downtown Chicago. The subject line read, "Emergency ex parte notice of preliminary injunction." I set my coffee mug down slowly, my analytical mind instantly shifting into defense mode. I opened the encrypted PDF attachment and began reading through the dense legal formatting. The petitioner listed on the filing was Jamal. I had never officially met Jamal. I had never stood in the same room as him, shaken his hand, or even spoken to him on the phone. I only knew of him through the unavoidable digital footprint of my sister Madison. She had married him 3 years ago in a lavish, widely publicized ceremony that I obviously did not attend. Jamal was 35 years old, an incredibly wealthy African-American real estate developer and a rising political star who had recently announced his candidacy for the city council. His entire public persona was meticulously crafted around integrity, community revitalization, and family values. But as I read through the 30-page legal injunction he had just filed against me, I realized his private tactics were nothing more than high-level extortion. The injunction was a direct and brutal assault on my livelihood. Jamal, acting as the heavily funded legal proxy for my parents, was petitioning a civil court judge to immediately freeze all financial accounts associated with my forensic accounting firm. Every corporate checking account, every payroll line of credit, and every personal savings account I had spent a decade building was targeted. The justification he provided to the court was pure fiction, but dangerously effective. The filing described me as a deeply unstable, estranged relative and a hostile flight risk. Jamal formally alleged that when I abandoned my family 10 years ago, I had taken control of critical family assets. The injunction claimed that because my parents had finally located me this morning, I now posed an immediate and severe threat of liquidating those assets and fleeing the jurisdiction. He argued that freezing my business accounts was the only way to protect the family trust from being completely drained before the matter could be resolved in court. I leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair, staring at the screen with a mixture of disgust and genuine professional respect. It was a viciously smart maneuver. Jamal knew exactly what he was doing. In the high-stakes world of forensic accounting and anti-money laundering investigations, reputation is the only currency that matters. My clients trusted me to handle millions of dollars in sensitive financial data. If a judge actually signed this injunction, my firm would be instantly paralyzed. I would be unable to pay my employees my commercial rent or my legal retainers. The ensuing public scandal of having my business accounts frozen for alleged financial misconduct would cause my corporate clients to terminate their contracts out of sheer self-preservation. It was a calculated corporate death strike. Jamal was trying to economically suffocate me so I would be forced to crawl to him and sign the trust documents just to survive. My office phone began to ring. It was my bank's corporate liaison calling to inform me that they had received a notice of pending legal action. I calmly answered the phone, authorized a preemptive legal hold protocol to secure my operating funds, and ended the call without a single tremor in my voice. Jamal had made a massive tactical error. He viewed me through the lens of my parents' outdated, deeply flawed narrative. To him, I was just the weak, discarded scapegoat of the family who had somehow lucked into running a small accounting shop. He assumed I would panic. He assumed I would call my parents crying, begging them to drop the lawsuit in exchange for my signature. He thought a mountain of aggressive legal paperwork and his imposing status would crush my spirit. He had no idea who he had just declared war on. You do not try to financially suffocate a federal-level money laundering investigator without ensuring your own financial house is spotlessly clean. I closed the email and picked up my secure mobile phone, dialing the direct line to my retained corporate attorney. I needed to block the injunction before a judge saw it tomorrow morning. But more importantly, I needed to look into exactly why a wealthy real estate developer and aspiring politician was so incredibly desperate to get his hands on a trust fund he had absolutely no legal right to touch. I pulled the digital copy of Jamal's injunction back up on my monitor, highlighting the specific paragraphs where he described my supposed psychological instability. The legal filing claimed I had a documented history of erratic behavior and sudden disappearances. Reading those words crafted by a high-priced lawyer caused a sharp, visceral memory to cut through my professional detachment. The polished mahogany of my desk faded, and suddenly I was 23 years old again, standing on the cracked, icy pavement of a Greyhound bus station on the worst night of my life. The air that night was a brutal 10 degrees below zero. I could still feel the biting wind slicing through my thin wool coat. My teeth had been chattering so violently I could barely speak. Richard and Brenda had told me we were going out for a nice family dinner downtown. Instead, they pulled into the grimy, poorly lit bus terminal. Madison, who was 20 at the time, had been sitting in the back seat holding up her phone with the camera flash blinding me in the dark. They had told me to get out of the car and check the schedule board. The moment my boots hit the pavement, I heard the heavy clunk of the automatic locks. I turned around just in time to see Richard shift the SUV into drive. The window rolled down exactly 2 inches. Madison's cruel laughter spilled out into the frigid air, mixing with Brenda's voice, telling her to make sure she got a good angle of my face for the video. They shouted that they would be back in an hour if I survived the local gang members, and then the tires squealed against the icy asphalt. I stood there completely alone in one of the most dangerous zip codes in the city, while my family drove away to post my humiliation online. They thought I would cry. They thought I would call them begging for forgiveness for whatever minor infraction I had committed that week. But as I stood there watching their taillights disappear into the snowstorm, something inside me finally snapped. The desperate need for their approval simply froze and shattered. I walked into the flickering fluorescent light of the terminal, stepped up to the plexiglass window, and emptied the crumpled bills from my wallet. I bought a one-way ticket to Chicago. I blinked, pulling myself back to the present. My eyes focused on the small silver frame sitting on the corner of my desk. Inside the glass was that exact bus ticket, faded and worn. $14. That was the total price of my freedom. That $14 piece of paper was the foundation of the accounting firm I now owned. Looking at it now, the lingering anxiety in my chest completely evaporated. Jamal was trying to use the legal system to recreate that night at the terminal. He was trying to lock me out in the cold and watch me panic. But I was no longer the freezing girl banging on a locked car window. I closed the injunction document and opened a secured application on my secondary monitor. As a licensed forensic accountant specializing in anti-money laundering, I had legal access to federal financial databases that ordinary citizens did not even know existed. I typed Jamal's full legal name directly into the search bar of my tracking software. If an aspiring city council member with a massive real estate portfolio was willing to risk federal perjury charges to illegally access my grandfather's trust fund, It meant he was drowning in a financial crisis he could not afford to make public. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling his corporate registration data and cross-referencing it with his public campaign finance disclosures. The software immediately began generating a complex and tangled web of interconnected shell companies registered under various variations of his legally documented name. I ran a deep-tier background check, scanning for hidden offshore routing numbers and sudden massive capital injections. Within 15 minutes, the algorithm flagged 3 separate commercial accounts tied to his primary real estate holding company. The numbers were staggering. Jamal was moving capital through anonymous entities, but his projects were publicly stalling. He was bleeding cash on a daily basis, faster than he could ever possibly hope to legitimately replace it. He desperately needed the liquid cash from my grandfather's trust fund to plug a hole in his campaign finances. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, watching the data populate line by line. Jamal had unknowingly picked a legal and financial fight with the absolute worst person on the planet. He thought he was merely freezing my bank accounts. He did not realize I was about to completely and ruthlessly dissect his entire financial existence. Less than 2 hours after I uncovered the massive financial black hole at the center of his real estate empire, my secure line rang. It was my attorney. Jamal's legal team had reached out, offering a temporary lift of the injunction in exchange for an immediate face-to-face settlement dinner. I agreed instantly. I did not agree because I was intimidated by his aggressive legal maneuvering. I agreed because in my line of work, the most crucial piece of evidence is often the behavior of the suspect when they believe they have the upper hand. I wanted to look the man trying to financially ruin me directly in the eye. The meeting location was an ultra-exclusive steakhouse in the River North District. It was the kind of establishment designed for Chicago power brokers, featuring dark mahogany walls, dim ambient lighting, and the low hum of million-dollar deals being negotiated over expensive scotch. When the hostess led me to a private, secluded corner booth, Jamal was already seated. He was an undeniably imposing figure. At 6'3", with broad, muscular shoulders and a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, he commanded the physical space effortlessly. He was handsome in a highly calculated political way, possessing a sharp jawline and a practiced, gleaming smile that did not quite reach his cold, assessing eyes. When I slid into the leather booth across from him, he did not stand to greet me. He did not offer his hand. He merely tapped the face of his heavy gold watch. "You are exactly on time, Sydney," he said, his deep baritone voice carrying a heavy note of smug authority. "I appreciate punctuality. It shows you understand the severe gravity of your current situation." I did not touch the sparkling water the waiter had poured. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression blank. "Let us skip the cheap intimidation tactics, Jamal. You froze my business accounts on completely fraudulent grounds, and your lawyers demanded this meeting. I am here. Speak." He let out a low, patronizing chuckle, shaking his head, as if he were dealing with a difficult child. He leaned heavily forward, resting his elbows on the table and interlacing his fingers. He was intentionally using his physical size to encroach on my space, a classic boardroom bullying tactic. "I am going to speak to you very plainly, because I am a busy man and I am running for city council," he began, his voice dropping to a serious, commanding register. "My campaign is built on community revitalization, integrity, and strong family values. Madison and I represent the bright future of this city. What my campaign absolutely does not need is a wild-card estranged sister popping out of the woodwork after a decade trying to hold family assets hostage." The sheer audacity of his narrative was almost impressive. He was gaslighting me in real time, aggressively acting as if I had hunted them down to cause trouble instead of acknowledging that they had ambushed me in my own office. "Your parents are good people, Sydney," he continued flawlessly, delivering his scripted lies. "They are deeply distressed by your erratic behavior today. The trust fund in question was always meant for Madison to secure her future and help build our family legacy. Your name is only on those documents due to an outdated legal technicality created by your grandfather. By refusing to sign the release forms, you are actively hurting your own sister. I protect my wife and I protect my political campaign. I will not let you create a messy public scandal just because you harbor some petty childhood resentment. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. He clicked a heavy silver pen, grabbed a slip of paper, and wrote out a number with smooth, practiced strokes. He tore the check loose and slid it across the polished wooden table. It stopped mere inches from my folded hands. The amount written in bold black ink was $50,000. I am a very generous man, Jamal said, leaning back against the leather booth with a deeply satisfied smirk. I know running a small accounting shop must be stressful. Take the 50 grand. Consider it an early inheritance or hush money, whichever makes you sleep better at night. Sign the power of attorney documents releasing the trust to Madison, and my legal team will withdraw the injunction against your business tomorrow morning. You take the cash, you disappear back into whatever quiet, lonely life you have been living, and we never have to see each other again. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon, watching me closely over the rim of his crystal glass. He was completely convinced he had just bought my compliance. He thought $50,000 was a life-changing fortune to me. He thought I was a frightened civilian buckling under the crushing weight of his political power and his ruthless legal threats. He had absolutely no idea he was sitting across from the very person who was actively preparing to dismantle his entire fraudulent existence piece by piece. I did not reach for the pen. I did not even glance down at the heavy black ink spelling out $50,000. Instead, I slowly raised my hand and pressed my index finger firmly against the center of the crisp slip of paper. Maintaining absolute eye contact with him, I slowly slid the check back across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly in front of his bourbon glass. You severely overestimate your current financial position, Jamal, I said, my voice completely level and stripped of any emotion. And you severely underestimate exactly what I do for a living. I am not some frightened civilian you can bully with aggressive legal paperwork and pocket change. I am a certified anti-money laundering investigator. When you served me with that fraudulent injunction this morning, you gave me a legal reason to thoroughly look into your background. I now know absolutely everything about your hidden assets and your desperate attempts to survive. The confident smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. His broad shoulders stiffened defensively. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, mirroring his earlier aggressive posture. Let us talk about your bright future, I continued, keeping my tone conversational, but razor sharp. You have 3 commercial real estate developments currently stalled in the zoning phase. Your primary holding company is hemorrhaging capital to maintain the illusion of progress. To cover the massive shortfall, you have been aggressively routing funds through 4 different anonymous shell entities registered in Delaware. But you made a series of incredibly amateur mistakes. 2 of those shell companies share the exact same registered agent. Another one lists a commercial post office box directly tied to your campaign manager's personal address. You do not have $50,000 to give me, Jamal. You are writing checks from an account that is already dangerously overdrawn. You need the liquid cash from my grandfather's trust fund, not to secure Madison's future, but to plug a massive illegal hole in your campaign finances before the Federal Election Commission notices the discrepancy. Jamal stared at me, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. The polished, charismatic politician completely vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate man. He quickly scanned the dimly lit restaurant, ensuring none of the wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables could hear the forensic dissection of his fraudulent empire. When he looked back at me, his jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle ticked violently near his temple. You think you are so incredibly smart? He hissed, dropping the polite facade entirely. You think running a quick internet search makes you a threat to me? You are nothing, Sydney. You are exactly what Madison and your parents always said you were. A pathetic, bitter little outcast who is completely obsessed with destroying the family that rightfully threw her away. You are just jealous because Madison has the beauty, the influence, and a powerful husband who will do whatever it takes to protect her. You have absolutely no one. You are sitting here alone, threatening a man who could easily crush your tiny little business with one quick phone call. His words were carefully designed to cut deep to trigger the traumatized 23-year-old girl who had been abandoned in the snow. He wanted an emotional reaction. He wanted to prove that I was the unstable, erratic woman his legal injunction claimed I was. He leaned in closer, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his face. "Go ahead," he whispered tauntingly. "Throw a tantrum. Show everyone in this restaurant exactly how crazy you are." I picked up my heavy crystal glass filled to the brim with ice water. I did not yell. I did not curse. With a swift flick of my wrist, I threw the freezing water directly into his smug face. The ice cubes loudly clattered against his expensive suit jacket, soaking his crisp dress shirt and dripping down his chin. Several patrons at the nearby tables gasped, turning their heads to watch the spectacle. I calmly set the empty glass back down on the table, picked up my purse, and stood up. "Do not ever contact my firm again," I said loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. I turned and walked out of the steakhouse, my head held high. As I pushed through the heavy wooden exit doors, I glanced back over my shoulder. Jamal was not angry. He was sitting in the booth, slowly wiping the water from his eyes with a linen napkin. And he was smirking. He had wanted me to do exactly that. He had intentionally provoked me in a crowded room full of important people. I had just handed him exactly what he desperately needed for his next strategic move. I woke up the next morning to the relentless vibration of my secure corporate cell phone. It was not Richard or Brenda calling to demand a signature. It was my top-tier clients. By the time I poured my first cup of coffee, I had 14 urgent voicemails from the chief financial officers of 3 different Midwestern manufacturing firms. In the risk-averse world of corporate finance, public drama is an absolute deal-breaker. I sat at my kitchen island and opened my laptop, completely ignoring the ringing phone. I bypassed my email and went straight to the source of modern public relations warfare: social media. It took less than 3 seconds to find out exactly what Jamal had been smirking about the night before. Madison had uploaded a video to both TikTok and Instagram. It was a masterclass in calculated digital manipulation. She was sitting on the floor of her immaculately decorated living room, wearing an oversized beige sweater, with her hair pulled into a messy bun. She wore absolutely no makeup, allowing the dark circles under her eyes to feature prominently. She looked exactly like a terrified, exhausted victim. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice trembling perfectly. "I did not want to bring family drama to the internet, but my husband and I are currently dealing with a terrifying situation." The screen sharply transitioned to a highly edited, grainy video captured by someone sitting 2 booths away at the steakhouse. The audio of our conversation was completely muted. The clip only showed Jamal sitting calmly with his hands folded peacefully on the table. Then it showed me violently throwing my entire glass of ice water directly into his face before storming out like an unhinged lunatic. Out of context, I looked completely deranged. The video cut back to Madison wiping away a single perfectly timed tear. "That woman is my older sister Sydney," she continued, her voice breaking. "She has struggled with severe mental instability for years. 10 years ago, she completely abandoned our family, cutting off all contact and breaking our parents' hearts. We searched everywhere for her, but yesterday she suddenly showed up at Jamal's office, demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars. When he gently refused to be extorted, she violently attacked him in public. Now she is threatening to invent vicious lies to ruin his city council campaign unless we empty our family savings account to pay her off. We are heartbroken and terrified. Please keep Jamal in your prayers." I stared at the screen, analyzing the metrics. The video had been live for less than 8 hours, and it already had 3 million views. The comment section was a massive digital lynch mob calling for my immediate arrest and tagging the Chicago Police Department. Madison had successfully weaponized her substantial influencer following to publicly assassinate my character. Jamal knew his legal injunction freezing my accounts would eventually be defeated in court. He needed a faster way to destroy my business. By creating a massive viral scandal, he was forcing my corporate clients to run away from my firm out of sheer self-preservation. My phone rang again. It was my lead investigator at the firm. Her voice was panicked as she reported that two of our biggest accounts had just submitted formal requests to suspend our auditing services pending an internal review of the viral video. My receptionist was currently fielding dozens of harassing phone calls from angry strangers who had managed to look up my business address online. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to issue a frantic, tearful apology video begging the internet for mercy. They wanted me to be so completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming public hatred that I would eagerly sign over my grandfather's trust fund just to make the nightmare stop. I closed the social media tab and took a slow sip of my black coffee. The panic they were trying to induce simply did not exist. Instead, a cold, razor-sharp focus settled over me. Madison had just made a catastrophic strategic error. By going fully public and specifically mentioning Jamal's city council campaign, she had permanently tied his political reputation to my name. She had essentially built a massive digital stadium and invited 3 million people to sit down and watch the fight. I picked up my phone and called my investigator back, instructing her to immediately route all incoming business calls to an automated voicemail stating our firm was undergoing a scheduled system upgrade. I told her to lock the front doors of the office and send the staff home with full pay for the rest of the week. I did not need to be in the office to execute my next move. I just needed my laptop and my encrypted access keys. Jamal and Madison wanted to use the internet to tell a compelling story about money and family. I was going to use the federal tax database to tell a much better one. I opened a heavily encrypted virtual private network and bypassed the standard public portals accessing the secure federal databases my firm used for high-level money laundering investigations. The first step was locating my grandfather's trust fund. For 10 years, I had assumed it was either depleted or legally transferred. I had never bothered to look because I never wanted a single dime of their money, but now they were using it as a weapon against me, so I pulled the primary ledger. The screen illuminated with a decade of financial transactions. My grandfather had set up an irrevocable trust meant to vest when I turned 25. I scrolled through the disbursement history, and the sheer audacity of what I saw made my blood run cold. 2 years after they left me at that bus station, the exact week of my 25th birthday, the withdrawals began. Regular massive wire transfers draining thousands of dollars at a time. The destination accounts were carefully masked, but the authorization forms were digitally archived. I pulled up the scanned PDFs of the withdrawal slips. Right there at the bottom of every single page was my signature, or rather, a pathetic attempt at my signature. I zoomed in on the pixelated ink. The loops were overly exaggerated, the pressure points were completely wrong, and the slant was unmistakably left-leaning. It was Brenda. She had always written her lowercase letters with that exact pretentious flourish. My own mother had been systematically forging my name on federal banking documents for 8 solid years. But petty theft was not enough to bring down a rising political star. I needed the final destination of the stolen funds. I opened a second monitor and pulled up the public campaign finance disclosures for Jamal's city council run. On the surface, his campaign was a brilliantly executed grassroots operation. He boasted about receiving thousands of small-dollar donations from concerned local citizens. It looked perfect on paper. However, forensic accounting is not about looking at the paper. It is about following the digital shadow the paper leaves behind. I ran a comparative algorithm cross-referencing the dates of the forged trust withdrawals with the dates of the sudden spikes in Jamal's campaign contributions. The timeline was a perfect, flawless match. But the money did not travel in a straight line. Jamal was too smart for a direct transfer, but he was too arrogant to realize his digital tracks were permanently visible to a trained investigator. I traced the stolen trust money as it moved out of the primary banking institution and into a holding account registered in Delaware. From there, the funds were immediately broken down into smaller, untraceable amounts, a classic structuring technique known as smurfing. These smaller chunks were wired to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, registered to a corporate entity that conveniently shared a mailing address with Jamal's primary real estate development firm. Once the money was thoroughly washed offshore, It was funneled back into the United States, packaged as anonymous donations to a political action committee directly funding Jamal's campaign. He was not just stealing an inheritance, he was committing textbook federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and severe violations of campaign finance laws. He had built his entire political platform on stolen money laundered through his estranged sister-in-law's forged identity. I sat back in my chair, the glowing screens reflecting in my eyes. The puzzle was completely solved. Jamal needed the power of attorney documents signed by 5 o'clock yesterday because his offshore accounts were currently being audited by a third-party compliance firm. He needed my signature to retroactively legitimize a decade of stolen money before the Federal Election Commission discovered the massive illegal hole in his campaign. Madison crying on the internet about her unstable sister was nothing more than a desperate smokescreen to distract the public while they tried to financially assassinate me in the background. I highlighted the entire transaction history from the forged signatures to the Cayman Islands routing numbers and hit export. I compiled everything into a massive, heavily encrypted digital dossier. I did not need to defend myself on social media. I did not need to argue with strangers in a comment section. I was holding a digital bomb that would permanently obliterate Jamal's political career, his real estate empire, and my parents' false reality. Just as the download completed, my secure cell phone buzzed with an incoming text from my corporate attorney. The message was brief, but it signaled the beginning of their next desperate attack. It read, "Sydney, they just filed an emergency petition in civil court. They are trying to place you under a legal conservatorship. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning." I smiled, saved the encrypted dossier to an external flash drive, and closed my laptop. They wanted to drag me into a courtroom and paint me as an insane, incapable victim. They were about to learn that you never invite a forensic accountant to a trial where she already has all the receipts. The emergency petition arrived at my apartment via a process server at exactly 7 o'clock the next morning. I signed for the thick manila envelope, tipped the courier, and carried it to my kitchen island. I poured a fresh cup of coffee and sliced open the seal. In the state of Illinois, an emergency conservatorship is a severe legal mechanism, usually reserved for individuals experiencing a catastrophic mental collapse. It strips a person of fundamental human rights, handing total control of their finances, medical decisions, and physical autonomy over to a guardian. Richard and Brenda had boldly petitioned the court to be appointed as the permanent legal guardians of my entire life and my business. Reading through their sworn affidavits was like reading a meticulously crafted psychological thriller. They heavily cited Madison's viral social media video as primary evidence of my supposed sudden and severe mental break. The petition painted a devastating picture of a troubled daughter who had disappeared a decade ago, only to violently resurface in the grips of profound paranoia. Richard formally swore under penalty of perjury that I had recently accosted his son-in-law in public, making wild delusional accusations about stolen family money. They claimed I was currently experiencing a dangerous manic episode, and that my highly sensitive corporate accounting firm was at immediate risk of complete operational collapse due to my erratic financial decisions. Their endgame was blatantly transparent to anyone who actually knew how to read financial motives. If the judge granted this emergency conservatorship, Richard and Brenda would immediately gain unrestricted legal access to my business accounts. They would not just freeze my firm, they would completely absorb it. With legal control over my company, they could systematically destroy the forensic data I had compiled. Even worse, they could legally route my firm's legitimate capital directly into Jamal's sinking political campaign, effectively using my own money to replace the trust funds they had already stolen. It was a terrifyingly brilliant legal maneuver designed to completely silence me and solve their massive financial crisis in one single strike. Madison had clearly tipped off the media because my phone began buzzing with alerts from Chicago blogs picking up the story. The narrative was perfectly tailored for maximum public consumption. The prominent family of a rising political star, desperately trying to save their mentally ill, estranged daughter from destroying herself. It generated an immediate wave of public sympathy for Jamal and my parents. The comments sections across social media platforms were flooded with people praising their incredible patience. My corporate clients were panicking, my professional reputation was being dragged through the mud, and my parents were walking into a civil courtroom expecting to hold the legal deed to my existence. I calmly finished my coffee, placed the petition back into the envelope, and dialed my corporate attorney. When he answered, his voice was tight with genuine concern. He had read the filing and knew exactly how dangerous a sympathetic judge could be in an emergency ex parte hearing. He started outlining a massive defensive strategy, talking about bringing in independent psychiatrists to evaluate me and pulling my pristine corporate tax records to prove my competency. I calmly cut him off right in the middle of his sentence. "We are not playing defense," I told him, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of panic. "We are not hiring doctors, and we are not begging a judge to believe I am sane. If we simply defend ourselves, we only validate their deeply flawed premise. We are going to walk into that courtroom, and we are going to completely obliterate their entire reality." I told him I was sending a secure courier to his office with an encrypted flash drive containing the compiled financial dossier on Jamal and the forged trust documents. I gave him specific instructions on exactly which documents to print and certify before the hearing. When I arrived at the downtown civil courthouse later that morning, the air was crisp and electric. Madison had predictably arranged for a small group of independent political bloggers and photographers to wait near the heavy bronze entrance doors. They wanted footage of me looking erratic, frightened, or angry to fuel their online narrative. As I stepped out of the black town car, I did not hide my face. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek professional style. I walked up the steps, ignoring the flashing cameras and the shouted questions. I did not look like a broken, paranoid victim. I looked exactly like the federal investigator I was. I pushed past the heavy wooden doors and walked straight through the metal detectors, preparing to step into the courtroom where my family was anxiously waiting to steal my life away. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 402 swung shut behind me, cutting off the noise of the hallway press. I walked down the center aisle with my attorney falling into step beside me. At the petitioner's table sat my entire family. They had dressed specifically for the narrative. Jamal wore a subdued navy suit, looking every bit the concerned civic leader. Madison had her hair pulled back, clutching a tissue and leaning on Jamal's shoulder. But Richard and Brenda were the main act. They looked visibly aged, wearing muted colors and expressions of profound manufactured exhaustion. They did not glare at me when I sat down at the respondents' table. Instead, Brenda let out a soft, calculated sob that was just loud enough to echo in the quiet room. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harrison, a stern-looking man with decades of family court experience, took his seat at the high bench. He looked down at the massive stack of emergency filings Jamal's legal team had submitted and sighed, rubbing his temples before asking the petitioners to present their opening argument for the emergency conservatorship. Their lead attorney, a highly polished corporate litigator, stood up but quickly deferred to Richard, claiming that a heartbroken father needed to speak directly to the court about his family tragedy. Richard slowly stood up from the heavy wooden table, resting his hands on the surface, as if he could barely support his own weight. He looked directly up at the judge, and his eyes actually welled up with tears. It was an absolutely Oscar-worthy performance, refined by years of lying to country club friends. "Your Honor," Richard began, his voice shaking with perfectly calibrated emotion. "We have spent the last 10 years agonizing over the whereabouts of our eldest daughter. We hired private investigators, we prayed every single night, and we kept her bedroom exactly the way she left it. We just wanted our little girl back. Now she has suddenly returned to us, but the woman sitting across this courtroom is not the daughter we raised. She is sick, Your Honor. She is suffering from profound paranoia and severe delusions, and she is currently a massive danger to herself and to the legacy her grandfather left her." Judge Harrison leaned forward, peering intently over his silver-rimmed glasses. He asked Richard to explain the 10-year estrangement and why they had not sought legal intervention sooner. Richard wiped a single tear from his cheek and launched into a masterful rewriting of history. "It was a misunderstanding, Your Honor," Richard said, his voice breaking beautifully on the final word. a harmless teenage argument that escalated out of control. We were at a bus station downtown dropping off a package. Sydney was always so incredibly fragile, so prone to dramatic outbursts over nothing. She got upset over a silly joke her younger sister made, and she just ran off into the busy crowd. We searched the terminal for hours. We drove the freezing streets all night. We had no idea she had boarded a bus out of state, holding a bitter grudge over a simple family squabble for an entire decade. It broke our hearts, but we forgave her long ago. We just want to get her the psychiatric help she so desperately needs before she completely destroys her own life and everything she has built. Then came the financial trap. Richard's attorney stepped forward carrying a thick leather-bound folder and handed it directly to the court clerk to pass up to the judge. "To officially prove her erratic state, Your Honor," the attorney said smoothly, "we are submitting the complete transaction history of the family trust fund. As you can clearly see over the last 8 years, the respondent has been making massive, unpredictable cash withdrawals. She has secretly drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from the account her grandfather set up, squandering the family money while completely ignoring her parents." Brenda let out another perfectly timed sob, burying her face in her hands, while Jamal patted her back consolingly. The attorney continued explaining that because of my supposedly manic financial behavior, the court needed to immediately transfer legal control of my forensic accounting firm and all remaining personal assets to my parents to prevent further self-destruction. The judge slowly flipped through the pages of the forged withdrawal slips, looking increasingly concerned by the massive numbers. My attorney shifted slightly in his chair next to me, but I did not move a single muscle. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the table, watching Richard dab his eyes with a linen handkerchief. They had just formally sworn under penalty of perjury that those bank statements were completely legitimate. The steel trap had officially snapped shut right on their own necks. The heavy silence in the courtroom was finally broken by the rustle of paper as the judge adjusted his reading glasses. He looked down from the high bench, his expression a mixture of judicial concern and misplaced sympathy for the grieving parents. He set the forged bank statements aside and turned his attention toward our table. He asked my attorney if we had brought any medical professionals to testify regarding my psychological state, or if we needed to request a brief recess to gather character witnesses. My attorney, Mr. Caldwell, pushed his chair back and stood up. He did not carry a massive stack of emotional affidavits. He held nothing but a single slim manila folder. He buttoned his suit jacket, looked directly at the judge, and stated that we had absolutely no intention of discussing my psychological state or my childhood. He declared that emotional arguments were entirely irrelevant to the conservatorship petition because the legal premise of the filing was based on a documented financial fraud. Richard blinked, his manufactured tears drying up instantly as his brow furrowed in confusion. Jamal shifted uncomfortably, his political instincts alerting him that the narrative was slipping out of their control. The judge frowned, warning Mr. Caldwell that making baseless allegations of fraud against a grieving family without proof would result in immediate judicial sanctions. Mr. Caldwell did not flinch. He requested permission to approach the bench and handed the single folder to the court clerk. "Your Honor," he began, his voice projecting clearly, "the petitioners just submitted financial records that they claim prove my client has been draining her trust fund for 8 years. They swore under penalty of perjury that those documents are authentic. However, we are submitting a comprehensive forensic document examination conducted by a former FBI handwriting analyst." The judge opened the folder, his eyes scanning the certified cover letter. Mr. Caldwell paced slowly in front of our table. The analyst was provided with the original bank withdrawal slips the petitioners submitted. He continued methodically laying out the trap. He was also provided with 10 years of my verified signatures from my corporate tax filings and anti-money laundering certifications. The results are conclusive. The expert determined with 100% certainty that not a single withdrawal slip from that trust fund was signed by my client. Brenda let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet courtroom. Her perfectly crafted mask of the heartbroken mother shattered. The signatures are blatant, clumsy forgeries, Mr. Caldwell stated, his voice echoing with absolute authority. The pressure points, the slant of the ink, and the exaggerated loops do not match my biometric writing profile. We also ran a comparative analysis against the known signatures of the petitioners. The forensic expert concluded, beyond any shadow of a legal doubt, that every single forged signature on those withdrawal slips was executed by the mother Brenda. The courtroom plunged into a stunned, suffocating silence. The judge stopped reading and slowly lowered the forensic report, staring down at the petitioner's table with a look of absolute judicial fury. He looked at Richard, who was staring at Brenda with panicked eyes. He looked at Brenda, who was trembling violently, her face completely drained of color. And finally, he looked at Jamal, whose polished political posture had collapsed. You must understand the severe gravity of what my attorney had done. By refusing to argue about emotions, he bypassed their elaborate social media narrative. He did not waste time trying to prove I was sane. He used their own submitted evidence to legally prove they were committing federal financial crimes. By swearing the bank statements were real, Richard and Brenda legally chained themselves to the forgery. My client is not suffering from paranoia or a manic episode, Mr. Caldwell concluded, stepping back to our table. She is a highly successful certified forensic accountant who discovered her parents have been systematically stealing her inheritance for nearly a decade. They did not file this emergency petition to get her psychiatric help. They filed it to illegally seize control of her accounting firm to bury the evidence of their massive financial crimes before federal authorities investigate. The judge took off his glasses. The sympathetic demeanor he had shown Richard just 10 minutes prior was gone, replaced by the icy wrath of a judge who realized he had been used as a pawn in an extortion scheme. He demanded that their attorney explain the findings in the FBI report immediately, but their highly paid corporate lawyer was completely speechless, staring at the forged statements in sheer terror, realizing his clients had forced him to submit fraudulent documents to a sitting judge. The highly paid corporate attorney stood completely frozen, his mouth slightly open as the catastrophic reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He looked at the forged bank statements lying on the judge's bench and then looked back at Richard and Brenda. In the legal profession, submitting knowingly falsified documents to a presiding judge is a fast track to immediate disbarment and potential criminal charges. He did not hesitate for a single second to save his own career. "Your Honor," the attorney stammered, his voice stripped of all its previous arrogant polish. "I was completely unaware of these forensic findings. My firm was retained based on the explicit assurance that these financial records were entirely authentic. Effective immediately, I must formally withdraw as counsel for the petitioners." He frantically began shoving his legal pads and pens into his expensive leather briefcase, refusing to make eye contact with Jamal, who was staring at him in sheer disbelief. Richard stood up, his hands shaking violently as he tried to salvage the collapsing narrative. "Wait! You cannot just leave us!" Richard shouted desperately, reaching toward the fleeing attorney before turning his panicked eyes back to the judge. "Your Honor, please. This is a massive misunderstanding. We did sign those papers, but it was only because Sydney was missing. We were just managing the trust fund to keep it safe for her. We had verbal permission to act as her financial proxies." Judge Harrison glared down at him, his face hardening into a mask of pure judicial contempt. "You expect this court to believe you had verbal permission to secretly drain hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore accounts while simultaneously claiming your daughter was a missing, unstable flight risk?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Before Richard could invent another desperate lie, my attorney, Mr. Caldwell, stepped forward again, holding up a small silver flash drive. He did not give them a single moment to breathe. "Your Honor, verbal permission is entirely irrelevant," Mr. Caldwell stated firmly, "because we do not just have forensic handwriting analysis. During our internal investigation into the destination of these stolen funds, my client traced the routing numbers to a specific commercial post office box located right here in downtown Chicago. This box was intentionally registered under a blind shell company to hide their identities. However, federal post offices are heavily monitored facilities. We subpoenaed the United States Postal Inspection Service for their security archives. Mr. Caldwell walked over to the multimedia cart positioned near the jury box and plugged the silver flash drive into the courtroom's presentation laptop. He pressed a button, and the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the wall flickered to life. The video playing on the screen was crystal clear, high-definition federal security footage. The digital timestamp in the bottom right corner displayed a date from just 3 months ago. The camera angle provided a perfect unobstructed view of the post office lobby. A few seconds into the recording, the heavy glass doors opened and Richard and Brenda walked into the frame. They did not look like concerned parents managing a family fund. They looked nervous, constantly checking over their shoulders. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as the footage showed Brenda stepping up to a wall of brass mailboxes. She pulled a small key from her designer purse and unlocked box number 419. She reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of envelopes clearly bearing the insignia of the primary trust bank. Mr. Caldwell clicked his mouse, switching to a second camera angle, positioned directly above the lobby writing counters. The new angle offered a sharp close-up view. The video clearly captured Brenda tearing open the bank envelopes, pulling out the cashier checks, and laying them flat on the counter. With Richard standing directly beside her, acting as a lookout, Brenda pulled a pen from her purse and quickly endorsed the back of every single check using my exact forged signature. She committed federal mail fraud and bank fraud in broad daylight on government cameras, Mr. Caldwell said, his voice echoing in the stunned courtroom. They stole my client's money, washed it through that post office box, and then had the sheer audacity to walk into this courtroom and attempt to use those very same stolen funds as evidence of her mental instability. Judge Harrison was absolutely furious. His face was a dark mottled red and the vein in his forehead throbbed visibly. He slammed his hand down flat against the heavy wood of the bench, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "This is a profound disgrace," Judge Harrison practically roared, his voice shaking with anger. "You came into my courtroom under the guise of grieving parents seeking a medical conservatorship. You attempted to weaponize the legal system to execute a hostile takeover of a successful business solely to cover up your own massive felony crimes." Jamal slowly sank down into his chair, his political posture completely destroyed. Madison covered her face with her hands, weeping genuinely for the first time all day. Richard and Brenda stood frozen at their table, staring at the monitor where their undeniable guilt was frozen on the screen. "This emergency petition is immediately dismissed with prejudice," Judge Harrison declared, sharply pointing a stern finger at my parents. "Furthermore, I am ordering the court bailiff to immediately confiscate those forged bank statements and that flash drive. I am personally forwarding this entire case file directly to the United States Attorney's Office. You are not leaving this courthouse with a conservatorship. You are leaving with an impending federal indictment." The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a resounding crack, finalizing the total collapse of their extortion scheme. The sharp sound seemed to snap Jamal out of his shocked paralysis. He immediately stood up, roughly pushing his chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the polished floor. He did not look at my parents. He did not offer his wife a comforting hand. He simply turned and practically sprinted toward the heavy double doors, desperate to distance himself from the toxic fallout he had carefully orchestrated. Brenda let out a pathetic whimpering sound, reaching out toward him, but he was already gone. The court bailiff, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression, stepped forward and forcefully collected the forged documents and the silver flash drive from the petitioner's table. Richard watched him take the evidence, his face completely drained of color. He looked like a man who had just been handed a terminal diagnosis. He tried to speak, to mumble some kind of apology or justification to the empty air, but no words came out. The reality of a federal criminal investigation was finally setting in. They had walked into this courthouse expecting to walk out with the legal keys to my accounting empire. Instead, they had just handed the federal government a perfectly wrapped gift box containing a decade of their own felonies. My attorney, Mr. Caldwell, calmly gathered our few files and placed them back into his slim leather briefcase. He turned to me with a small, satisfied smile. "You were absolutely right, Sydney," he whispered quietly as we walked toward the exit. "Defending your sanity would have been a massive waste of time. When someone hands you the rope, you just let them tie the knot." I nodded, acknowledging his excellent work, but my focus was already shifting to the hallway outside. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the bright fluorescent light of the courthouse corridor. The press bloggers Madison had invited were still gathered near the elevators, but they were currently ignoring me. Their cameras were pointed directly at Jamal and Madison, who were locked in a vicious public argument near the marble water fountain. The polished civic leader facade had completely melted away, revealing the ruthless, panicked man underneath. Jamal was leaning aggressively over Madison, his face contorted with rage, jabbing his finger toward her chest. "You told me this was going to be simple," he hissed loudly enough for the echoing hallway to catch every single word. "You said your sister was weak. You said she would panic and fold the second we filed the petition. Now I have a judge forwarding a criminal fraud file to the United States Attorney right in the middle of my campaign. You and your idiot parents just destroyed my entire career." Madison was crying, but it was not the pretty rehearsed weeping she used for her social media videos. It was ugly, terrified sobbing. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "It was not my fault, Jamal," she pleaded, grasping desperately at the lapels of his expensive charcoal suit. "You were the one who hired the lawyers. You were the one who told us to forge the rest of the documents to make it look like a manic episode. We only did exactly what you told us to do." Jamal violently slapped her hands away from his suit. "Do not ever say that again," he snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "I had absolutely nothing to do with those trust funds. You and your parents stole that money. If the feds come knocking, I am throwing all three of you directly under the bus to save my campaign." I walked slowly down the marble corridor, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. The sound drew their attention. Jamal snapped his head in my direction, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and absolute terror. Madison shrank back against the wall, wiping her face frantically. I did not stop walking. I did not engage in their screaming match. I simply approached the spot where Jamal was standing, reached into my tailored blazer, and pulled out a single crisp white file folder. I did not hand it to him. I simply opened my fingers and let the folder drop. It hit the marble floor right at the toes of his expensive leather shoes, spilling a few printed pages. The top page was a highlighted copy of Title 18, United States Code Section 1343, the federal statute for wire fraud. It detailed the exact 20-year maximum prison sentence for laundering money through digital networks. "Check your campaign accounts, Jamal," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "The money you stole is already gone. The federal authorities have everything. Enjoy the rest of your election season." I stepped right around the fallen folder and walked straight toward the elevator, leaving them completely destroyed in the hallway. I stepped out into the crisp Chicago air, taking a deep breath of absolute freedom. Behind me, inside the sprawling courthouse, the reality of my parting gift was finally sinking into Jamal's calculating mind. He had picked up the printed federal statute I dropped at his feet. As a real estate developer who routinely dealt with massive commercial contracts, he knew exactly what that piece of paper meant. It was not a threat. It was a formal notification of execution. I had successfully traced the dark money from my grandfather's trust fund through the offshore account and directly back into his political action committee. His impenetrable firewall had been completely breached. By the time my town car pulled up to my apartment building, Jamal's meticulously constructed political empire was already beginning to fracture. The bloggers Madison had foolishly invited to the courthouse had captured the entire hallway screaming match. Within an hour, the footage of a prominent city council candidate accusing his own in-laws of stealing money was trending across local news networks. The narrative of the caring family desperately trying to save their unstable daughter had instantly evaporated. In its place, a much darker and more lucrative story was emerging. A story about a corrupt politician drowning in hidden debt and a catastrophic family civil war. Jamal's secure cell phone began ringing relentlessly. These were not the sympathetic calls of concerned citizens. These were furious, demanding calls from the wealthy downtown elites who had heavily funded his campaign. Political donors in Chicago do not tolerate public embarrassment, and they absolutely despise federal investigations. The rumor of impending Internal Revenue Service and Federal Bureau of Investigation involvement had spread through the financial district like wildfire. His top-tier backers were demanding immediate in-person meetings to review the campaign ledgers. They wanted to know exactly where their money was going, and Jamal had absolutely no clean records to show them. The stolen trust fund money was inextricably mixed with legitimate donations, poisoning his entire campaign treasury. Panic is a fascinating emotion to observe in powerful people because it strips away all their polished charisma and reveals their core survival instincts. Jamal was a predator, and predators do not hesitate to chew off their own limbs to escape a trap. He realized instantly that Madison and her parents were no longer useful assets. They were massive legal liabilities tied directly around his neck. As he sat in the back of his heavily tinted luxury SUV speeding away from the courthouse, Jamal dialed his private wealth manager. He did not ask for advice. He issued a direct, ruthless order. He instructed his banker to immediately freeze every single joint account he shared with Madison. He canceled her platinum credit cards, revoked her signing authority on their domestic staff payroll, and locked her out of their shared investment portfolios. Madison had spent the last 3 years living completely insulated by his wealth, treating my parents to lavish vacations and buying endless designer goods to flaunt on social media. In less than 5 minutes, Jamal completely severed her financial life support. He was building a defensive wall around his remaining legitimate assets and throwing his wife directly to the wolves. When Madison finally arrived back at their sprawling Lincoln Park mansion later that afternoon, she found her keycard deactivated. She had to ring the security buzzer just to get into her own home. Jamal was waiting for her in the grand foyer, pacing aggressively across the imported Italian marble floors. He did not ask how she was holding up after the traumatic court hearing. He did not comfort her. He threw her rejected black credit card onto the entryway table. "Your parents lied to me," Jamal yelled, his voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. "They told me the money was clean. They told me you had legal rights to that trust fund. Now I have federal agents preparing to tear apart my entire life because your mother is a clumsy amateur forger." Madison backed away against the heavy mahogany door, sobbing hysterically and begging him to understand. Jamal stepped forward, towering over her with absolute contempt. "I do not care about your tears, Madison," he snarled. "You have exactly 24 hours to fix this massive disaster. You are going to take your parents, you are going to crawl on your hands and knees to your sister, and you are going to beg her to withdraw that forensic report. You offer her whatever she wants. If she refuses, and my campaign goes down, I am filing for an emergency divorce. I have an ironclad prenuptial agreement. I will throw you out of this house with absolutely nothing, and I will personally testify against your parents in federal court to save myself. Now get out of my sight and fix it." I had barely been home for 3 hours when the apartment intercom buzzed. I was sitting on my sofa watching the local news cycle dissect the sudden implosion of Jamal's entire political campaign. I muted the flat television and checked the security monitor. My building concierge looked incredibly uncomfortable. He told me there was an older, desperate couple in the lobby begging to come up. They were crying and causing a scene, but they were not aggressive. They were just desperate. I knew exactly who it was. I could have told the concierge to call the police and have them removed for trespassing, but a federal investigator never turns down a voluntary confession. I pressed the button and calmly told him to send them up. I unlocked my front door and left it slightly ajar, walking back to the kitchen island to pour myself a cold glass of water. A few short moments later, the heavy oak door slowly pushed open. Richard and Brenda stepped into my apartment, and the transformation from earlier that morning was staggering. All of the manufactured arrogance had completely evaporated. Richard looked like a hollow shell of a man. His shoulders were slumped, and his expensive suit looked wrinkled and far too large for his frame. Brenda was practically hyperventilating. Her makeup was entirely washed away by genuine tears, and she was clutching a crumpled tissue in her trembling hands. They stood in the foyer of my home, looking around at the vaulted ceilings, unable to comprehend the life I had built completely without them. "Sydney, please." Brenda choked out her voice, cracking pitifully. "Please do not throw us out. We just need 5 minutes." I leaned heavily against the marble counter, taking a slow sip of my water. I did not invite them to sit down. I just looked at them, waiting in an absolute silence. The silence broke them faster than any interrogation technique ever could. Richard suddenly dropped to his knees, right there on the imported hardwood floor. My wealthy father, a man who had spent my entire childhood demanding absolute obedience, was kneeling at my feet, weeping openly. "We are so incredibly sorry, Sydney," he sobbed, his voice echoing in the quiet apartment. "We lost everything we had. We were drowning in massive debt trying to keep up our lifestyle. We did not know what else to do." Brenda rushed forward, dropping to her knees next to him, grasping frantically at the hem of my trousers. I stepped back, forcing her to let go. "We only meant to borrow it," Brenda cried, tears streaming down her face. "We thought we could take the money from your trust fund, invest it, and put it back before you ever found out, but we lost that money too. We were terrified of losing the house. Then Jamal found out. We thought he was going to turn us in, but he offered to help. He said if we gave him the rest of the trust fund, he could run it through his real estate developments and double it. He completely lied to us, Sydney. He took all of it and washed it right into his political campaign. And now the government knows," Richard said, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. "Jamal just threw Madison out of their house. He completely cut off her credit cards. He told us that because Brenda forged the signatures, the federal authorities are going to put all the blame squarely on us. He is going to testify against us to save himself." Richard reached into his jacket pocket with shaking hands and pulled out a thick envelope bearing the official seal of the Department of the Treasury. He laid it gently on the floor between us. "It arrived exactly 2 days ago," he whispered. "It is an official notice of audit from the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. They are demanding a full accounting of the trust fund. If we cannot explain where the money went, we are going to federal prison." "You are our only hope, Sydney," Brenda wailed, pressing her hands to her face. "You are a genius with numbers. You know how these federal audits work. You can fix the ledgers, you can tell them it was a misunderstanding, and you authorize the transfers." I stared down at the two pathetic aging figures cowering on my polished floor. They were not apologizing for abandoning me. They were not apologizing for the 10 years of agonizing silence. They were only apologizing because they had finally been caught by the federal government. They were looking at me not as a beloved daughter, but as a convenient magical shield they could quickly hold up to completely block the devastating legal consequences of their own spectacular greed. I did not even offer them a towel for their endless tears. I did not move from my spot, leaning against the cool marble of my kitchen island. The sheer audacity of their request hung in the air, heavy and toxic. They were not asking me for a loan. They were asking me to commit multiple federal felonies to cover up the felonies they had already committed. Brenda realized the silent weeping was not breaking my resolve, so she immediately shifted tactics, reverting to the emotional manipulation she had perfected during my childhood. She pushed herself up from the floor, sitting on her heels, and looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Sydney, you have to think about your sister." Brenda pleaded, her voice taking on a frantic, high-pitched quality. "Jamal has completely locked her out. He is ruthless. If he goes down for this campaign finance fraud, he will make sure Madison takes the fall with him. He will leave her completely penniless and homeless. She is your little sister. You cannot just stand there and let her life be destroyed when you have the power to stop it. You are rich, Sydney. Look around you. You have this beautiful penthouse and a wildly successful business. You can fix this. We are blood. Blood." I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. Blood did not keep me warm when you intentionally left me in a freezing blizzard exactly 10 years ago. Blood did not stop you from forging my signature on federal banking documents for 8 years. Do not dare invoke family ties now just because the Internal Revenue Service is knocking on your door. Richard suddenly scrambled to his feet, his stiff knees popping loudly in the otherwise completely quiet room. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, trying to regain some semblance of the authoritative patriarch he used to be. Be reasonable, Sydney, he urged, stepping slightly closer but keeping a safe distance. We are not asking you to pay the money back. We know it is gone. We are just asking you to use your accounting firm to legitimize the transfers. You do this kind of thing for massive corporations all the time. You know exactly how the federal tax codes work. You know the loopholes. You could easily draft some retroactive consulting contracts. Make it look like you authorized the withdrawals to invest in Jamal's real estate projects as a silent partner. If you just claim the money was a legitimate business loss, the federal auditors will back off. You have the professional credentials to make it look completely bulletproof. No one has to go to prison. I stared at him, feeling a profound sense of pity, mixed with absolute disgust. You actually believe that I said my voice dangerously quiet? You actually believe that I would risk my federal licenses, my entire corporate reputation, and my own freedom to commit perjury and fraud just to save you from the consequences of stealing my own inheritance? Richard threw his hands up in exasperation, as if I were a stubborn child refusing to understand simple logic. We are your parents, he shouted, his desperation bleeding back into anger. We gave you life. We raised you. We paid for your food and your clothes for 23 years. You owe us. If you do not help us, they are going to take everything. The government will seize our house in Atlanta. They will freeze our retirement accounts. We will be destitute. You have the power to make this entire nightmare disappear with a few strokes of a pen. Are you really so bitter and vindictive that you would watch your own mother and father be handcuffed and dragged into a federal courtroom? I set my water glass down on the marble counter with a sharp, definitive click. The heavy sound made Brenda flinch visibly. I am not bitter, Richard, I replied, maintaining absolute composure. I am simply immune to your toxic manipulation. You spent my entire life convincing me that I was worthless while you worshipped the ground Madison walked on. You drained my grandfather's legacy to fund a fraudulent lifestyle, and you happily fed the remaining scraps to a corrupt politician. Now that your house of cards has violently collapsed, you expect me to lay my own body across the tracks to stop the train. Brenda began sobbing hysterically again, rocking back and forth on the polished floor. Please, Sydney, she wailed, reaching out with trembling hands. Please, we are begging you to show some mercy. You are the only one smart enough to fix the ledgers. You are the only one who can truly save us from this nightmare. You cannot just walk away and abandon us like this. Abandon you, I said, the words echoing with a hollow irony. You drove away from a Greyhound station in a blizzard while I stood on the curb with $14. You did not look back. You did not call the police to check if I froze. You did not hire an investigator. You spent 10 years living in luxury, funded by my grandfather's money, and never once wondered if I had a roof over my head or food on my plate. I walked slowly around the marble island, closing the physical distance between us. Richard shrank back slightly, but I stood directly over him, looking down at the pathetic man who used to terrify me. Stop crying, Brenda, I commanded, my voice cracking like a whip. Stop pretending this is about a fractured family needing to heal. I want you to look me in the eye and say the actual truth out loud. I want you to admit exactly why you finally decided to pick up the phone yesterday morning. Brenda choked on a sob, shaking her head frantically. Because we missed you, she wept, covering her face. Because we realized our terrible mistake and we wanted our daughter back. I slammed my hand flat against the marble countertop. The sharp sound made them both jump. Do not lie to me, I warned, my tone dropping to a dangerous absolute calm. You did not miss me. You missed the convenience of having a scapegoat. When Madison wanted a new car, you took my college fund. When Richard wanted peace and quiet, you locked me in my room. And when Jamal needed a fall guy for a federal tax evasion scheme, you suddenly remembered you had an estranged daughter whose signature you had been forging for a decade. Say it, Richard. I want to hear you say it out loud. Richard looked up at me, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked at the front door and then back at my hardened expression. He knew the emotional manipulation was completely useless. The only way out of my apartment was through the absolute truth. You cannot keep playing the victim, Richard. I pushed further, my eyes locking onto his. You are out of options. Tell me exactly why you came to Chicago, I demanded, stepping even closer until I was towering over him. Tell me why you ambushed me in my lobby and tried to force me into a conservatorship. Because we needed a shield, Richard finally whispered, his voice breaking under the crushing weight of his own admission. Because Jamal told us the Internal Revenue Service was going to audit the campaign and trace the money back to the trust fund. He said, if we could just get you to sign the power of attorney documents, we could legally backdate the transfers. We could make it look like you authorized everything. And if I had signed those papers, I asked coldly, crossing my arms over my chest, what would have happened to me when the federal agents showed up with a warrant for my arrest? You would have gone to prison, Brenda blurted out, her face buried in her hands. You would have taken the federal charges. Jamal said you were strong enough to handle it. He said you did not have a husband or children to leave behind, so it would not matter as much if you served the time. He said it was the only way to save Madison's lifestyle. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniably toxic. There it was. The absolute naked truth, stripped of all its fake parental concern and manufactured tears. They had spent months planning to literally hand me over to the federal government to serve a 20-year prison sentence just so their golden child could keep living in a Lincoln Park mansion and her corrupt husband could win an election. Thank you, I said simply, my voice completely steady. That is exactly what I needed to hear. You never loved me. You never missed me. I was never a daughter to you. I was just a disposable asset you thought you could sacrifice to save yourselves. Richard looked up, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. He understood that confessing had not earned him any mercy. It had only solidified his complete destruction. You promised you would help us if we told the truth, he stammered, grasping at my trousers. I never promised you absolutely anything, I replied, stepping back and pulling my leg out of his pathetic grasp. I just wanted you to finally admit what you truly are before I deliver the final absolute blow. You walked into my home today expecting salvation, but you will only find exactly what you truly deserve right now. I turned away from their stunned faces and walked deliberately over to my leather briefcase resting on the entryway console. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out my sleek silver tablet. For years, they had successfully convinced themselves that the night at the bus station was just a minor misunderstanding. They had completely rewritten the narrative to protect their own delicate egos. They told their country club friends that I was simply a rebellious young adult who overreacted and ran away. But as a forensic investigator, I deal strictly in undeniable facts and preserved digital evidence. I walked back into the living room and stood in front of them. When Madison posted her tearful video yesterday morning claiming I was an unstable monster, she made a massive miscalculation. She assumed her digital footprint was entirely clean. She forgot that I have access to enterprise-level data recovery software capable of pulling deleted files from archived server caches. I tapped the screen of my tablet, waking it up, and opened a specific video file. You thought Madison deleted this 10 years ago? I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She did delete it from her main social media feed after a few hours, when people started commenting that it was legally considered child abandonment and reckless endangerment. But she originally uploaded it to an old video sharing site, and the internet never truly forgets. I turned the volume all the way up and pressed play. The sudden blast of audio filled my quiet apartment. It was the loud howling of a brutal Chicago blizzard violently whipping against the microphone of a cell phone. Then came the sound of the SUV's heater blasting on maximum. The camera angle was from the back seat looking through the slightly cracked passenger window. There I was, a 23-year-old girl wearing a thin wool coat standing alone on the cracked icy pavement of one of the most dangerous bus terminals in the city. My shoulders were hunched against the biting wind and my teeth were visibly chattering. I looked so incredibly small and terrified, surrounded by the dark shadows of the terminal. The contrast between my freezing reality and the warm, luxurious interior of your vehicle was absolutely sickening to watch. Then the voices started. It was Brenda's voice, sharp and cruel, echoing from the tablet speaker. "Make sure you get her face," Brenda said, laughing loudly. "Let us see how long she lasts out there before she starts crying and begging us to unlock the doors. Serves her right for spilling coffee on my new Chanel bag." Then Madison's voice chimed in, completely devoid of any sisterly affection. "She looks so pathetic." Madison giggled, zooming the camera in on my shivering frame. "Let us go grab dinner and come back in an hour. If she is still alive, we will let her back in." Madison finished her sentence with a wicked laugh. The video captured the loud metallic clunk of the automatic car locks, engaging. The engine revved, and the camera panned to show my terrified face fading into the distance as the SUV sped away, leaving me completely abandoned in the freezing dark. The video ended abruptly, plunging my apartment back into a heavy, suffocating silence. I looked down at Richard and Brenda. They were staring at the black screen of the tablet, completely horrified. Hearing their own voices echoing with such callous cruelty stripped away the last remaining shreds of their parental illusion. They could no longer hide behind the lie of a simple family misunderstanding. The evidence of their absolute malice was staring them right in the face. I slowly lowered the tablet, my eyes locked onto theirs. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The sheer weight of the truth was heavy enough to crush them. "You drove away laughing," I said, the words cutting through the quiet room like a surgical scalpel. "You left your own daughter in a freezing, crime-ridden terminal over a spilled cup of coffee. You bet on whether I would cry or beg. You did not care if I froze to death or if I was attacked. You only cared about making a funny video to gain attention on the internet." Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She just let out a weak, pathetic gasp, wrapping her arms around her own stomach as if she were physically ill. Richard stared at the floor, entirely incapable of moving. I stepped back, sweeping my hand across the expansive luxury of my penthouse, pointing toward the heavy mahogany door. "This is the family you want me to save?" I asked, my voice dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. Richard broke the heavy silence. He did not attempt to defend the horrific video. He knew that the digital evidence of their cruelty was absolute and undeniable. Instead, he crawled a few inches closer on his knees, his hands clasped together in a pathetic, desperate prayer. "I know we were terrible to you." He choked out, tears spilling rapidly over his flushed cheeks. "I know we do not deserve your forgiveness or your mercy. But please, Sydney, you have to look past the past right now. The federal government is going to take absolutely everything from us. You know powerful people in the agency. You work alongside these federal auditors all the time. Just make a phone call for us. Tell them it was all a simple clerical error. Tell them the trust fund was mismanaged but not stolen. Call them off, Sydney. Just call them off and we will never bother you again. We will disappear from your life completely and you will never have to see our faces." I watched him beg. I watched the man who used to scream at me for leaving a single light on in the house now groveling pathetically on my imported hardwood floor, offering to permanently trade his presence in my life for his freedom. Brenda was kneeling right beside him, nodding frantically with her hands pressed tightly over her heart. They truly believed that the world worked this way. They believed that because I was wealthy and successful, I could simply wave a magic wand, pull a few corrupt strings, and make a massive federal investigation vanish into thin air. They thought I was exactly like Jamal, willing to aggressively bend the law to protect my own blood. I slowly walked over to my kitchen island, picking up my glass of water, and took a final, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. "You really do not understand how the federal government operates," Richard Ray said. My voice eerily calm, echoing slightly in the large open space of the penthouse. You think the Internal Revenue Service just randomly selected Jamal's campaign out of thousands of local elections across the state. You think some automated federal algorithm flagged your clumsy forged signatures by pure chance. You think I can just pick up my phone, call a favor, and ask a federal agent to look the other way. Richard stared at me, his breath hitching painfully in his throat. Can you not do that? He whispered, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope. I set the glass down on the marble counter. I cannot call them off, I stated clearly, letting every single syllable carry the full devastating weight of my professional authority. Because I am not just a forensic accountant who occasionally works with federal agencies. My firm is the specific independent federal contractor that the Internal Revenue Service hired to audit local political action committees in this exact district. The desperate hope in Richard's eyes instantly shattered, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Brenda stopped rocking, her breath catching audibly in her chest. I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us, my presence towering over their broken, trembling forms. The audit notice you received in the mail did not happen by accident, I continued, my tone dropping to a cold, surgical precision. When Jamal filed that ridiculous injunction against my business yesterday morning, he accidentally gave me full legal cause to thoroughly investigate his financial background. I found the shell companies, I found the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and I found every single forged withdrawal slip bearing your clumsy handwriting, Brenda. Jamal thought he was being incredibly clever, I said, watching their entire world violently collapse in real time. He thought he could use you to steal my inheritance and then use the legal system to completely silence me. But all he did was hand a federal investigator the exact roadmap to his own criminal enterprise. I did not need to call anyone to report you. I compiled the digital dossier myself. I cross-referenced the stolen trust money with his campaign ledgers. And then I formally submitted the whistleblower report directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I am the exact reason you are currently being audited by the federal government. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating sound of complete, inescapable defeat. Richard slumped backward, his hands falling limply into his lap. He stared blankly at the wall, his mind finally comprehending that there was absolutely no loophole, no secret favor, and no escape. I had not just refused to save them. I was the very architect of their destruction. Brenda let out a low, guttural wail, collapsing entirely against the floor, sobbing into her hands as the reality of her impending federal prison sentence finally crushed her entirely. I did not offer them a tissue or a hand up. I simply walked over to my wall panel and pressed the button for building security, instructing them to escort my parents out of the building. That was on a Tuesday afternoon. By Friday evening, Jamal was executing the most desperate and spectacular financial gamble of his entire life. He knew the Internal Revenue Service was circling his campaign accounts, but federal audits take time to officially lock down assets. He had a razor-thin window of opportunity to replace the stolen trust fund money with legitimate campaign donations. To do that, he organized a massive emergency fundraiser at the historic Palmer House Hilton in downtown Chicago. It was billed as the pinnacle event of his city council campaign, an exclusive $5,000 a plate gala dedicated to family values and community integrity. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of gilded architecture and dripping crystal chandeliers. The room was packed with the absolute elite of the city. Tech executives, real estate moguls, and high society philanthropists mingled holding crystal flutes of vintage champagne. A classical string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to a room built entirely on impending federal fraud. Jamal was working the floor with the manic energy of a man walking the plank. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored tuxedo, his smile bright and perfectly practiced as he shook hands and kissed cheeks. To the wealthy donors handing over massive checks, he looked like the charismatic future of Chicago politics. But if you looked closely at the tight clenching of his jaw and the frantic darting of his eyes, you could see the absolute terror radiating off of him. Despite the vicious screaming match in the courthouse hallway and the brutal financial lockout Jamal had forced Madison to attend, a family values candidate cannot host a massive gala without his beautiful, loving wife by his side. Madison was standing near the towering champagne pyramid, wearing a stunning emerald green designer gown that cost more than most people make in a year. But the luxurious fabric could not hide the sheer panic vibrating through her body. Her makeup was applied heavily to conceal the dark, exhausted bags under her eyes. She smiled automatically whenever a donor approached, but the smile was stiff and lifeless. She gripped her crystal glass so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She knew she was standing in the middle of a sinking ship, playing the role of the devoted wife to a man who had promised to throw her into federal prison the moment the ship went under. Richard and Brenda were also forced to be there, corralled into a VIP booth near the front of the stage. Jamal needed the visual of a supportive extended family to secure the trust of the older conservative donors. They were dressed in their absolute finest formal wear, but they looked like hostages. Richard was sweating profusely, constantly, dabbing his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He jumped every time a waiter approached the table, terrified it might be a federal agent serving an indictment. Brenda sat completely frozen, staring blankly at the elaborate floral centerpiece. She had not spoken a single word since she collapsed on my apartment floor 3 days earlier. The reality that she had forged federal documents and handed the evidence directly to the government had broken her mind. They were surrounded by millions of dollars of wealth and influence, yet they had never been more utterly powerless. Jamal needed to raise over $1 million tonight. He was offering VIP access, future zoning favors, and exclusive real estate contracts to anyone willing to write a massive check to his political action committee. His plan was brutally simple. If he could deposit enough clean money into his accounts by Monday morning, he could instruct his lawyers to claim the offshore Cayman Island transfers were just an unauthorized accounting error. He would return the stolen trust money to my parents, claim ignorance, and hope the federal auditors would drop the criminal charges in favor of a heavy civil fine. It was an incredibly arrogant and highly illegal strategy, but it was the only card he had left to play. He stepped up to the massive stage, tapping the microphone to command the attention of the ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing, and the wealthy crowd turned their attention toward the podium. Jamal flashed his brilliant, charismatic smile, raising his hands to welcome his generous donors. He began his rehearsed speech about transparency, honesty, and the vital importance of family. He was completely in his element, bathing in the applause and the promise of financial salvation. He thought he had successfully bought himself enough time to escape the trap. He did not know that the trap had already closed, and the executioner was already in the building. I stood in the opulent lobby of the Palmer House Hilton, smoothing the lapels of my tailored black evening suit. The heavy brass doors leading to the grand ballroom were flanked by 4 massive security guards wearing matching dark suits. Jamal was taking no chances tonight. He had hired a private security firm to ensure that only the wealthiest, most influential donors made it inside. I watched a few late-arriving guests present their gold-embossed invitations to the head of security. The guard checked a digital tablet, nodded respectfully, and pulled back the heavy velvet rope. I stepped forward, my black stiletto sinking slightly into the plush carpet. As I approached the velvet rope, the head guard immediately stepped into my path, holding up a massive hand. His eyes quickly scanned my lack of an invitation and my sharply tailored business attire. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his voice firm and completely devoid of warmth. "You are not on the approved clearance list for this ballroom. I need to see your invitation and a corresponding photo identification." "I do not have an invitation," I replied, maintaining a calm, even tone. "And I am not here to make a political donation." The guard frowned, his posture instantly shifting from polite doorman to physical barrier. "Then you need to turn around and exit the lobby immediately," the head guard instructed. "If you refuse to leave the premises, I will have you physically escorted out." I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a solid leather credential case and flipped it open. The bright overhead chandelier light caught the gold seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. "I am not a guest," I told him, holding the federal badge up so he could read the bold print. "I am the lead independent forensic investigator contracted by the Internal Revenue Service. This event is currently being funded by stolen assets tied to an active federal wire fraud investigation. You can step aside and let me do my job, or I will have the actual police arrest you for obstruction of justice." The guard stared at the badge, his eyes widening slightly. Private security firms survive by avoiding federal trouble at all costs. He looked at the gold seal and then looked at his men. He simply unclipped the velvet rope and took a large, deliberate step backward, effectively clearing my path. He gestured for his men to stand down, realizing the severe legal danger of interfering with federal authorities. "Thank you," I said, snapping the leather case shut and slipping it back into my pocket. I pushed open the heavy brass doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. The wave of sound hit me instantly. It was the collective murmur of the Chicago elite, laughing, drinking, and negotiating. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with champagne, weaving through the crowds of billionaires and socialites. The crystal chandeliers above cast a warm, golden glow over the immaculate floral centerpieces. It was a monument to wealth built entirely on a foundation of my stolen inheritance. I began walking slowly down the center aisle of the ballroom. I did not rush. I let the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels cut through the ambient noise. I ignored the confused stares, keeping my eyes focused directly on the front of the room. I was the only element in the entire building that he could not control. I spotted the VIP table first. Richard was violently trembling, wiping his face with his soaked handkerchief. Brenda was staring blankly at her empty plate, looking completely hollowed out. Madison was gripping her crystal glass so hard I thought it might shatter in her hand. Their eyes were glued to the stage where Jamal was standing behind a polished acrylic podium holding a microphone. He was in the middle of a passionate crescendo about accountability and community trust. His rich baritone voice washed over the wealthy crowd, mesmerizing them. I continued walking down the aisle, closing the distance between the back doors and the stage. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. And then it happened. Jamal turned his head slightly to address the left side of the room, and his sweeping gaze caught my solid black silhouette. He stopped speaking right in the middle of a word. The silence over the massive sound system was sudden and deafening. The crowd murmured in confusion, wondering if there was a technical glitch. But it was not a glitch. Jamal gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles turning completely white. He was staring directly into my eyes, realizing that his executioner had just bypassed his heavy security and walked right into the heart of his sanctuary. He was completely trapped in front of the entire city. The silence stretched for an agonizing 3 seconds. The wealthy donors sitting at the tables nearest the stage began to exchange confused glances. Jamal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his crisp silk bow tie. He forced his gaze away from me, staring blindly into the glaring stage lights as he desperately tried to reboot his charismatic persona. He cleared his throat so forcefully, the microphone let out a sharp metallic whine, causing several people in the front row to wince. As I was saying, Jamal continued, his voice noticeably higher and thinner than it had been a moment before. "We are standing at a critical crossroads in the history of this great city. For too long, Chicago has been governed by shadows and backroom deals. We need transparency. We need absolute, unshakable accountability." It was a spectacular display of political hypocrisy, and I stood perfectly still near the center aisle, letting him hang himself with his own words. He was actively preaching about transparency, while desperately trying to launder $1 million of stolen inheritance right in front of the people he was claiming to protect. "I need you to trust me," Jamal said, raising a trembling hand to gesture to the crowd. "I need you to look at my family sitting right here in the front row. Look at my beautiful wife, Madison, and her wonderful parents, Richard and Brenda. They are the absolute bedrock of my campaign. They taught me that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in loyalty and moral integrity." The sheer audacity of his script was almost laughable, but the physical reality of his panic was destroying the performance. A heavy bead of sweat rolled down his forehead, catching the bright stage lights. He quickly wiped it away with the back of his hand, ruining his polished image. His breathing was becoming shallow and rapid. He tried to pace across the stage to project energy, but his movements were jerky and uncoordinated. His eyes kept darting back to me, terrified that I was going to shout something from the aisle. But I did not need to shout. I simply let my presence mentally suffocate him. Madison noticed his bizarre behavior first. She saw his frantic eye movements and turned her head to follow his line of sight. When she saw me standing tall and completely unbothered in my federal uniform, her breath hitched audibly. She grabbed Richard's arm, her manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Richard and Brenda slowly turned around in their seats. When they saw me standing in the ballroom, the little remaining color in their faces completely drained away. Brenda covered her mouth with both hands, looking as if she were about to be physically sick right onto the pristine linen tablecloth. The donors at the surrounding tables were beginning to notice the strange dynamic. Wealthy investors are highly observant people. They look for confidence and stability. Right now, they were watching a supposedly commanding political leader completely melt down on stage, while his VIP family looked like they were attending a funeral. "We must build a future based on clean, honest hard work," Jamal stammered, completely losing his place in the speech. He looked down at his acrylic podium, shuffling his index cards frantically. "We cannot allow corruption to steal from our future generations. We must protect the innocent. We must hold the guilty responsible no matter who they are." He was reading the generic platitudes, but they sounded like a bizarre accidental confession. The string of lies was unraveling faster than he could speak them. I decided it was time to move. I did not walk toward the stage. Instead, I turned my body slightly and began walking with deliberate, measured steps toward the side of the ballroom, where the audiovisual control table was located. The technical director was sitting behind a massive mixing board, controlling the lights, the microphones, and the massive dual projector screens mounted behind Jamal. Jamal saw me change direction, and his panic escalated into sheer, absolute terror. He knew exactly what I was doing. He knew what kind of digital evidence I possessed. He tried to speed up his speech, rushing the words together in a desperate attempt to reach the fundraising pitch before I could reach the soundboard. "Therefore, I am asking you tonight to open your hearts and your checkbooks," Jamal practically shouted, the microphone distorting his frantic voice. "I am asking you to invest in a clean, honest campaign. We need your financial support right now, this very minute, to secure a victory against the dark money trying to destroy us." He was begging. It was not a political pitch, it was a desperate plea for a financial life preserver. I reached the edge of the audiovisual table and stopped. I stood right next to the technical director, who looked up at me with a questioning expression. I did not say a word to him yet. I just looked back at the stage, locking eyes with Jamal one last time as he stood sweating profusely behind his podium, completely powerless to stop what was about to happen next. The technical director was a young man wearing a black headset and a confused frown. He reached for the main slider on his mixing board, likely intending to cut Jamal's microphone due to the painful feedback echoing through the speakers. I placed my hand firmly over his wrist, stopping his movement. I leaned in close so he could hear me over the ambient noise of the ballroom and the frantic voice of the politician on stage. I pulled my federal credential case from my pocket for the second time that night and opened it right over his keyboard. United States Department of the Treasury. I said, my voice low, but carrying absolute authority. This campaign is currently the subject of an active federal criminal investigation for wire fraud and money laundering. Step away from the console immediately. The young technician looked at the gold badge, looked at my unblinking expression, and immediately threw his hands up in the air. He did not ask any questions. He simply rolled his office chair backward, surrendering the entire audiovisual command center to me. I pulled the silver encrypted flash drive from my pocket. It was the exact same drive that had terrified the civil court judge just 2 days prior. I located the primary input port on the master laptop, plugged the drive in, and bypassed the security protocols with a few rapid keystrokes. Up on the stage, Jamal realized exactly what was happening. His panicked eyes locked onto the glowing screen of the laptop in front of me. He completely abandoned his scripted speech about family values. He grabbed the edges of the acrylic podium and leaned forward, shouting into the microphone. "Security!" he yelled, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Security, get her out of here right now! Cut the power to the monitors! Cut the power!" But the private security guards lining the walls did not move a single inch. Their boss had already seen my federal badge in the lobby, and he had given strict orders not to interfere. Jamal was completely isolated on that massive stage, screaming orders that no one was going to obey. I found the master display switch on the mixing board. With one swift motion, I pulled the slider all the way down, killing the generic campaign promotional video that was playing on a loop behind him. The massive 20-foot dual projector screens plunged into pitch-black darkness. The sudden visual blackout caused the entire ballroom to fall deathly silent. The wealthy donors lowered their champagne flutes, sensing the dramatic shift in the atmosphere. I double-clicked the master file on my flash drive and slammed the display slider back up to the maximum output level. The screens instantly flared back to life, bathing the entire stage, and Jamal's sweating face in a harsh, brilliant white light. But it was not a campaign logo or an American flag projected behind him. It was my forensic accounting wire map displayed in stunning high definition for every single billionaire and political donor in the city to see. The graphic was massive and undeniable. It was a complex, highly detailed spiderweb of financial data built by a certified investigator. At the very top of the screen in bold crimson letters was the title Federal Fraud Tracing Matrix. Below that, the map clearly displayed the origin point. My grandfather's irrevocable trust fund. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom as the donors processed the information. I had formatted the presentation specifically for maximum public devastation. Bright red arrows traced the flow of stolen capital away from the trust account directly into the local commercial post office box. Next to the post office box, I had embedded the high-resolution security camera screenshot of Brenda standing at the counter, actively forging my signature on the cashier checks. The red lines continued downward, showing the money moving into Jamal's anonymous Delaware shell companies. The exact dates and the exact dollar amounts were listed in stark black text. The arrows then crossed international borders, pointing directly to the offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. And finally, the thickest red line of all routed the laundered money right back onto American soil, plunging directly into Jamal's primary political action committee, the very same committee that was currently hosting this $5,000 a plate gala. The silence in the room transformed into an angry, buzzing hive. These were highly educated financial elites. They did not need a law degree to understand what they were looking at. They saw the shell companies, they saw the offshore routing numbers, and they saw the forged checks. They realized in an instant that they had just written massive political donations to a man who was actively laundering stolen family money. Jamal turned around slowly, looking up at the massive 20-foot screen towering behind him. The bright red arrows reflected in his terrified eyes. His political career, his real estate empire, and his entire carefully constructed life were projected on that wall in the form of undeniable federal evidence. He was completely exposed. I picked up a spare wireless microphone from the control table, switched it on, and stepped out from behind the console, preparing to address the angry crowd. I raised the microphone to my lips, letting the sharp audio briefly ring out to command the absolute attention of the room. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice perfectly steady, echoing off the gilded ceilings of the grand ballroom. "My name is Sydney. I am a certified forensic accountant, a federal contractor for the Internal Revenue Service, and according to the man currently sweating on your stage, the unstable estranged sister who ran away 10 years ago." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the soft clinking of the crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of Chicago power brokers turned their heads away from the massive projector screens to stare directly at me. I began a slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle, forcing the crowd to part ways for me. "The man asking for your millions tonight has built an entire platform on integrity and family values. I continued gesturing toward Jamal, who looked as though he might physically collapse behind the podium. But as you can clearly see on the screens behind him, his entire political existence is funded by a massive criminal enterprise. That trust fund at the top of the matrix was an irrevocable account left to me by my late grandfather. For 8 consecutive years, my mother Brenda, sitting right there in the front row, systematically forged my signature on federal banking documents to drain that account completely dry. A wave of disgusted muttering rolled through the wealthy crowd. Several high-profile donors sitting near the VIP table physically pushed their chairs back, distancing themselves from Richard and Brenda, as if my parents were carrying a highly contagious disease. But petty theft was not enough, I said, taking another measured step forward. When the stolen funds ran out, Jamal stepped in. He used his real estate development shell companies to launder the remaining stolen inheritance offshore. He washed the money through the Cayman Islands to hide its origin, and then funneled it directly into the campaign treasury that is hosting this exact event. I paused, letting the severity of the federal crimes sink into the minds of the financial elite. These were people who meticulously protected their wealth. The absolute last thing they wanted was their legitimate money mingling with laundered funds in a federal dragnet. Every single dollar you donate tonight is not going toward community revitalization, I announced, projecting my voice to reach the very back of the massive room. Your $5,000 plates are not funding a bright new future for Chicago. Your money is going directly into a frantic, desperate attempt to replace stolen capital before the federal auditors officially freeze his campaign accounts on Monday morning. By writing a check to this man tonight, you are actively funding a federal cover-up. That was the exact phrase that broke the dam. Federal cover-up. Billionaires do not play games with the Internal Revenue Service. An older man with silver hair sitting at a prominent center table stood up abruptly. He threw his linen napkin onto his half-eaten plate with obvious disgust. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his checkbook, and aggressively ripped a freshly written check into tiny pieces, letting them flutter to the floor. "I am canceling my wire transfer immediately," he announced loudly to the men sitting next to him. "This is an absolute disgrace." His action triggered a massive chain reaction. The wealthy elite of Chicago are incredibly protective of their public image, and no one wanted to be photographed at a gala funded by wire fraud. Chairs scraped loudly against the polished floor as dozens of people began standing up simultaneously. Wives grabbed their designer coats, and husbands signaled to their security details. The mass exodus began. Jamal's campaign staff, who had been standing near the exit doors to collect donations, were suddenly overwhelmed by furious elites demanding the immediate return of their checks. People were shouting at the staff, threatening massive civil lawsuits if their funds were processed. The elegant, refined atmosphere of the million-dollar fundraiser collapsed into a chaotic, angry scramble for the exit. Jamal stood frozen behind the podium, watching his political empire completely disintegrate before his eyes. He could not speak. He could not defend himself. The digital evidence glowing on the 20-foot screens behind him made any lie completely useless. Then a sharp, piercing scream ripped through the ballroom. "Stop it!" Sydney Madison shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysterical rage. She shoved her way out of the VIP booth, her stunning emerald green gown catching on the edge of the table and tearing slightly. She did not care. She stomped into the center aisle, marching directly toward me with her hands balled into tight fists. Her carefully applied makeup was completely ruined by angry tears streaking down her face. "You are ruining everything," Madison screamed, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. "You are destroying my life. Jamal is going to leave me, and we are going to lose the house. You have your stupid accounting firm and your money. Why could you not just sign the papers and let us be happy? Why are you doing this to your own family?" She stood mere inches from me, breathing heavily, her chest heaving with manic exertion. She expected me to yell back. She expected a massive, dramatic, sisterly argument right there in the middle of the fleeing crowd. But I just looked at her with the same cold, clinical detachment I used to review fraudulent tax ledgers. "I am not doing this to you, Madison," I replied, my voice low enough that only she could hear it over the chaotic din of the fleeing donors. "You did this to yourselves the moment you decided my life was worth less than your lifestyle. You wanted the federal spotlight. Now you have it. Before Madison could scream another panicked insult, a loud booming sound echoed from the rear of the ballroom. The heavy brass doors did not just swing open. They were violently thrust apart, hitting the wall with a resounding crash that stopped the fleeing billionaires right in their tracks. A massive, coordinated wave of men and women wearing dark tactical vests flooded into the elegant space. The bright yellow block letters across their backs read FBI and IRS Criminal Investigation. The federal authorities had not waited for Monday morning. The sheer scale of the financial panic I had deliberately triggered by displaying the wire map had forced their hand. They needed to secure the campaign ledgers and the physical assets before Jamal or his donors could destroy the evidence. Federal agents secure the room, a loud, authoritative voice commanded over a portable bullhorn. Nobody moves until we verify your identity. The remaining high society guests, who were used to being treated like royalty, instantly froze. The ballroom devolved into absolute terrified compliance. Teams of armed agents immediately secured every exit, blocking the catering doors and the private VIP elevators. Another team moved swiftly down the center aisle, completely ignoring the millionaires and billionaires. They were entirely focused on the stage. Jamal had not moved from the podium. He watched the federal agents marching toward him with the blank, uncomprehending stare of a dead man. Two heavily armed FBI agents bounded up the stage steps. They did not read him his rights gently. They spun the charismatic family values candidate around, violently slamming his chest against the clear acrylic podium. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the microphone that was still resting on the stand, amplifying his complete destruction for the entire room to hear. Jamal, you are under federal arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and severe violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act, the lead agent barked, pulling him away from the podium. Down on the floor, Madison finally snapped out of her rage and realized she was standing directly in the crosshairs of a federal raid. She turned to run, her emerald gown swishing heavily around her legs, but she did not even make it 3 steps. A female IRS agent intercepted her, grabbing her arm and twisting it professionally behind her back. Madison shrieked, thrashing wildly like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum, but the agent expertly secured her wrists with heavy zip ties. You are being detained on suspicion of criminal conspiracy and accessory to federal tax evasion, the agent stated coldly, reading her the Miranda rights as Madison sobbed uncontrollably into the plush carpet. I turned my gaze to the VIP booth. Richard and Brenda had not tried to run. They were physically incapable of movement. The last remaining threads of their country club facade had completely disintegrated. Richard was clutching his chest, hyperventilating as he watched his wealthy friends and business partners glare at him with absolute disgust. He was a pariah. His social standing, his home, and his freedom were evaporating right in front of his eyes. Brenda simply slid out of her chair and collapsed onto the floor, weeping silently as 2 agents approached their table with handcuffs drawn. They were finally going to pay the exact price they had tried to force onto me. The lead IRS agent, a tall man with silver hair and a sharp suit underneath his tactical vest, approached me near the audiovisual table. We had spoken on the phone several times during my independent contract work, but this was our first time meeting in person. Sydney, he said, extending a professional hand. You certainly know how to put together a comprehensive audit. We were monitoring the offshore accounts, but the live confession you provoked expedited the warrants. I shook his hand and pulled the encrypted flash drive from the master laptop. I handed it to him, watching his fingers close around the metal casing. The master ledgers, the forged signature analysis, and the complete routing numbers are all on that drive, I told him, my voice completely stripped of any lingering family tension. My professional contract for this specific case is officially concluded. The agent nodded, slipping the drive into his evidence pouch. We will take it from here. Go home, Sydney. You earned it. I turned my back on the stage. I did not look at Jamal being perp walked through the lobby. I did not look at Madison crying in zip ties. I did not look at my parents as the agents read them their rights. I walked out of the Palmer House Hilton and stepped into the crisp, cold Chicago night air. The city lights glittered, reflecting off the wet pavement. I reached into my purse, pulled out my secure mobile phone, and opened my contact list. I systematically deleted Richard, Brenda, and Madison. Then I permanently blocked their numbers. I slid the phone back into my bag, took a deep breath of the freezing air, and walked away completely free.